But if he goes nuclear, then all bets are off. And the war aims of the United States, I think, do change, because I don't see how we stand by with a Russian leader using nuclear weapons anywhere. I just don't think that's a tenable situation for the world.
That's the voice of Jon Wolfsthal. He is a senior advisor to Global Zero and a member of the board of the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists. He's today's guest on Press the Button, a Plowshares Fund podcast dedicated to nuclear policy and national security. And now, here are your co-hosts Tom Collina and Alex Hall.
Thanks, Angela, and welcome back to Press the Button. Hey, Alex, great to see you. Thanks for subbing in today. How you doing?
I'm well, Tom. Thank you. Good to join you. And before we dive into our policy updates, I do just want to take a moment to recognize the humanitarian toll of the war in Ukraine. Since February 24th, there have been approximately 1.5 million refugees, meaning that this war has caused the fastest displacement of people in Europe since World War II. The UN estimates also put the civilian death toll at more than 360 civilian lives, but the real toll is likely much higher. Also, since the war began, Russia has detained approximately 13,000 protesters for their demonstration against Putin's actions. But Tom, what do you have for us on the nuclear news?
Well, thanks for that, Alex. And yes, I think we're all just still understanding how horrible and how tragic this war is in Ukraine. And as terrible as things are, they probably will get worse. I think that's something we all have to recognize, that we have not seen the worst of this crisis yet, probably by any stretch of the imagination. And that's tough because everybody wants to do more to stop this tragic war faster. But at the same time, I think we have to resist certain things that are being suggested. For example, putting U.S. troops in the mix or U.S. support for a no-fly zone. As much as I want to stop this war as anyone, I think those moves will just increase the chances of direct conflict between U.S.-Russian troops, and that can spin out and escalate into a wider European war, a much larger conventional war, and possibly nuclear war. And once we realize how catastrophic a nuclear war would be, there is no other option than to avoid it by all means. So, for many people, a nuclear war may not seem likely, and I don't think it is. It's still possible, and it would still be catastrophic. And if we bring U.S. and Russian forces into direct conflict, things could quickly spiral out of control. And as we'll discuss later in the show, Russia is actually using its nuclear weapons as a shield for the purpose of keeping other countries out of this conflict. And tragically, it's working, and there's not much we can do about it. But again, so as tragic as this situation is, we need to prevent it from getting much, much worse. Meanwhile, in the realm of tragic things happening in Ukraine, we had a major scare last week at the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant in Ukraine, the largest power plant in Ukraine, where Russian forces irresponsibly shelled the plant late last week, causing a fire and concerns that the plant might be severely damaged. Luckily, and I do think we got lucky, the power to the plant remained intact, and at this point, there's no major risk of a meltdown. But we do need to recognize that the plant has now been taken over by Russian forces, who are now in control of the plant and are giving orders to the Ukrainian staff that are running the plant, and we don't really know what's going on there. So the situation remains tremendously dangerous. We've never had a major war like this in a nation with so many operating nuclear power plants. It's a very dangerous situation. Attacking an operating nuclear power plant is a tremendously bad idea, and let's hope the Russian forces handle the situation better going forward. If all that weren't bad enough, we're seeing evidence that the whole situation in Ukraine is affecting other aspects of national security policy. In this case, particularly the Iran nuclear deal. We had been hoping that the deal would be reached this week from negotiations in Vienna, but it now appears that Russia is throwing a wrench into this process as well and working to slow it down. I think the best way to understand this is that if all the sides reach a deal for the Iran nuclear deal to come back into force for the United States and Iran, that will allow Iran to sell its oil again on the world market. And that's a lot of oil. Iran has a lot of oil. This would be good for the United States and others who are trying to keep oil supply up and prices down as they move to sanction Russia and Russia's oil sector, and therefore take Russian supply off the market. But for the same reason that the West wants Iran's oil back on the market, Russia does not. Moscow wants any oil sanctions against it to hurt the West through higher prices, and bringing Iran's oil onto the market would dampen this effect. So at the same time, Russia has a shared interest in preventing an Iranian nuclear bomb. So I think there are interests in this case in Russia on both sides, and let's hope negotiations in Vienna can find a way to work this all out, and soon. We will keep our eyes on this developing story. But turning back to today's podcast, what do we have for early warning?
On Early Warning, I'm joined by Sara Sirota, a politics reporter at The Intercept, to discuss what, if any, effect this crisis in Russia and Ukraine may have on Biden's nuclear posture review here in the United States.
Great. Looking forward to that conversation. And then in a similar vein, I sit down with Jon Wolfsthal for the main segment interview later on, who is a former nuclear policy advisor to President Obama, and then as well to then Vice President Joe Biden. We're going to discuss Putin's nuclear alert from last week and what it all means for the future of U.S. and global nuclear policy. It's a great conversation, so please stay tuned.
And remember, if you like what you hear, please hit subscribe and leave us a rating. Your feedback helps us improve this show. And with that, let's get into today's episode. The clock is ticking.
And now, early warning, early warning, early warning, early warning. A 7-minute synopsis of this week's nuclear news.
Thanks, Del. Since Russia invaded Ukraine, there has been a lot of focus on Russia's nuclear weapons policy and Putin's veiled threats at nuclear conflict. But how might the conflict in Ukraine affect U.S. nuclear policy? To help us get a better understanding of this is Sara Sirota, a politics reporter at The Intercept. Welcome, Sara.
Hey, thanks for having me.
So to start, can you share a quick summary of what the president's nuclear posture review is and when it's expected to be released?
So each president since Bill Clinton has released their own nuclear posture review stating their position publicly on declaratory policy as well as the nuclear weapons programs that the U.S. currently has and may continue to have into the future. So President Biden was expected to release his NPR early in 2022. Now, because of the war in Ukraine, it's expected that he is delaying the release of that strategy. So it's not really clear exactly when at this point it'll be released.
Can you tell us a bit about what was expected from Biden's NPR before Russia invaded Ukraine? So take us back before the past week.
Sure. So I think a lot of experts were very curious to see how President Biden would approach 3 nuclear weapon programs that President Trump had started. One was the sea-launched cruise missile, a nuclear-armed sea-launched cruise missile. Another was his decision to field the W-76-2, a nuclear warhead, as well as the decision to keep the B-83 gravity bomb around that President Obama had decided to retire.
So I think a lot of nuclear disarmament experts were hopeful that President Biden would give those programs a second look and perhaps decide to cut back. In addition, there was hope that he would look at the US's policy and potentially adopt a no first use policy, which is highly coveted.
So from your reporting on this and conversations with people in the field, do you think that there will be changes now that we're facing the reality of a Russian invasion in Ukraine?
I think a lot of experts are hopeful that he will give a closer look and be even more tempted to adopt a no first use policy. But I think that there is some cynicism that he would actually do that because there's definitely going to be increased pressure now to march forward with the different weapon programs and policies that Trump had adopted. Just that's sort of a reflexive position when people are afraid they want to adopt more weapons. So there's definitely going to be more pressure on him, whether or not the events of the past week or two actually cause him to change course, I think is up in the air.
In looking at what the NPR might have been before this invasion and after, what do you think is the biggest point of contention in the NPR right now between those that want to see this kind of nuclear weapons status quo maintained and those that are working to advocate to decrease the arsenal?
I think the biggest point of contention are these 3 weapon programs that Trump decided to pursue. Earlier this week, there was a House Armed Services Strategic Forces Subcommittee hearing where the most influential Republican on that panel said, it's ever more clear that we need to keep around these weapons. And he expects that there will be bipartisan opposition if Biden decides to roll them back. So I think right now, those programs are the biggest point of contention, as well as the no first use policy. But it's very interesting because I think by deciding to push forward with these new programs, Trump sort of shifted the debate. Previously, I think there was much stronger debate about, for example, the long range standoff weapon, which is a nuclear armed air launched cruise missile. But that has sort of been replaced by now the sea launched cruise missile debate. Of course, there's always conversations about the intercontinental ballistic missile system program that the United States has and whether or not that's really necessary. It's widely considered to be the most dangerous because of its vulnerability to attack, as well as the least necessary in the US nuclear triad. So there's always debate about whether or not the US needs to continue on with its current path of replacing the Cold War era system, the Minuteman III. But whether or not that actually has legs and is possible is, I think, less likely probably than 3 programs that I had mentioned that started under Trump. Something that I think is really fascinating is most people, I feel like, are not aware that the US is undertaking the biggest nuclear modernization program right now since the Cold War.
Thank you so much, Sarah. This is very helpful as we take a broader look at how this conflict may have ramifications on our nuclear policy here in the US. And we'll be following this closely, as I'm sure you will. So thanks so much for your time.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Bonnie Fisk, Deputy Director of Development at Plowshares Fund and a Press the Button listener. When I first joined Plowshares Fund back in 2018, I didn't know anything about nuclear weapons. I came here with just the motivation to help create a safer world and a commitment to lifelong learning. My colleagues told me they'd teach me everything I need to know, and did they ever? Still do, actually. As I continue to grow ever more committed to Plowshares Fund and the reduction and elimination of nuclear weapons, I found that I rely on Press the Button so much. It's a resource for the latest analysis and a place where I can drop in fully, without distractions, and gain new insight into this issue I've come to know and love. I find inspiration from the weekly guests and our partners, and I know I'm a better contributor to our cause just by tuning in. Please consider supporting Plowshares Fund and helping make Press the Button possible by making a donation today. Visit plowshares.org/donate today. And thanks for listening.
Last week, Russian President Vladimir Putin directed his military to place Russia's nuclear weapons on heightened alert. A few days later, the Pentagon announced it would postpone a routine missile test launch out of concern that the launch could be misunderstood by Russia as a real attack. In other words, the Pentagon was worried that Russia might launch a nuclear weapon by mistake. These actions, in the context of Russia's brutal and unjustified war on Ukraine, are causing public anxiety about the possibility of a nuclear conflict not seen since the Cold War. But what does Russia's higher alert status really mean? And how likely is it that Putin might go nuclear? To help us understand the nuclear aspects of the war in Ukraine and the risks involved, we are happy to be joined by Jon Wolfsthal, the former senior director at the National Security Council during the Obama administration and former advisor to then Vice President Joe Biden. He is now a senior advisor at Global Zero and a member of the board of the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists. Jon, great to have you here.
Thanks for asking me on, Tom.
So, as we were just describing, President Putin has directed his nuclear weapons to be placed on heightened alert. Meanwhile, the Pentagon says it will not be changing its alert levels. What do you think this heightened alert really means?
So it's unclear, Tom. And after President Putin made his public remarks about ordering his nuclear forces on increased alert, a lot of people scratched their heads because we watch the Russian nuclear complex very closely. Russia has over 1,000 nuclear weapons already able to launch on very short notice within minutes, as does the United States. And very quickly, the United States government said, we haven't seen any change in alert levels. So, for example, Russia has a lot of mobile missiles on land. We didn't see those flush out into the field. Russia has a lot of nuclear warheads in central storage. The United States hasn't seen or publicly confirmed that we've seen those warheads moving to be deployed on battlefield systems. So what we have seen, and my suspicion is General Gerasimov, the Russian chief of defense, and Minister Shoigu, the minister of defense, sort of scratched their head and said, okay, well, we have to do something because Putin has told us to do something. And what they've done is increase their personnel readiness. They've sent a number of additional crews out to individual facilities. They probably have recalled people from whatever vacations they might have been able to make, so that if they do, in fact, have to increase the tempo of operations, they can do so a little bit more quickly. But we haven't seen anything that I think, and that I think US military leaders would suspect, that we're about to see a nuclear launch by Russia, at least no more than what we have seen on a day-to-day basis.
And yet, by postponing the missile test launch, the Pentagon was reflecting the possibility of a misunderstanding. I certainly think, and I think you would agree, that it was a prudent step that the Pentagon took, but it's also a sign of the Biden administration being worried about accidental war. What do you make of it?
Yeah, I would put it slightly differently, but I think your concept is right. President Biden has a lot of experience on these issues. He, I think, probably like you and me, had hoped that we wouldn't need this particular brand of experience anytime soon. But he understands well from the 1960s and 70s and 80s how things can go sideways when it comes to a military crisis in Europe. And so I think, just out of an abundance of caution, unless there's a need to do something, then he's going to avoid it if it can be seen as a prelude to a strike. So if we don't have confidence that the Russian early warning system, which picks up our missile launches, is really good, then we probably shouldn't launch a test missile in the middle of a crisis. Now, I don't think that would stop us from, say, shipping over the 82nd Airborne to Poland, because there we are actually trying to signal our resolve and our willingness and desire to defend every inch of NATO territory. But, a routine Minuteman missile launch isn't something that we should be doing in the middle of a crisis. And quite frankly, it's something that in the Obama administration and other administrations, we routinely change the schedule of if world events suggest it. So, for example, when I was in the middle of the NPT review conference in 2015, we were going to do a Minuteman missile launch, and we asked the Pentagon, look, can you just delay this a couple of weeks, because it's not the message we want to send in the middle of the NPT review conference that, oh, by the way, we're modernizing our nuclear forces, even though everybody knew we were modernizing our nuclear forces. So it does happen, and I think it's the right thing to do.
Now let's look more broadly at the nuclear risks here. I mean, how do you look at the risks of war, particularly nuclear war in Ukraine? We like to think it's a low probability, high consequence event. There are ways it could happen. Which are the ways in which you think nuclear weapons could be used, and how likely is it?
We worry about this a lot, Tom, and we always talk about the risk of escalation, right? The nuclear weapons aren't going to be used because the United States and Russia wake up one morning and say, okay, today's the day for a global nuclear holocaust. It's going to be out of two scenarios where tensions get high and the fog of war, taking down communication networks, cyber attacks that look like a prelude to a strike, are seen by one side as worrisome and leads them to take nuclear action that they wouldn't otherwise take. So the pressure for escalation and preemption. I don't worry about that from the United States side, quite frankly. We are not in an existential situation. It's Putin that has put himself in an existential situation. And so that leads to the second concern, which is that, as Russian doctrine states, if they were to find themselves where the Russian state was at risk, and we believe that Putin defines the existence of the Russian state as the same thing as his existence, then he reserves the right to use nuclear weapons. And so the concern, of course, is that by supporting the legitimate resistance of the Ukrainian military, NATO and European allies are funneling military support into Ukraine, and Putin starts to really lose this war. Right now, he's not winning quickly, but he's making progress. But if he were to find that he was really losing, would he use a nuclear weapon to tell everybody to back off, or to interdict supply lines in Western Ukraine, those are things I really do worry about, because while I don't think Putin is insane, I do think he cares about nothing more than his own survival, and the norms and the laws and the risk of escalation to nuclear use, I don't think would stop him from using a single nuclear weapon if he thought it would advance his survival. So that's really what I'm watching. And I think what's really interesting to me is, as in the US system, Putin can order it, but it doesn't mean the military will necessarily follow through. And so I think we do have questions about whether his military understands that a nuclear strike would be a war crime, that they would then be individually responsible, and that the United States and the world would see that they're held accountable. And I wrote a piece recently in Barron's that said I think the United States needs to communicate very clearly that if Putin wants a conventional war in Ukraine, while we don't want that, that's something we're prepared to fight, not ourselves, but through the Ukrainian people. But if he goes nuclear, then all bets are off. And the war aims of the United States, I think, do change, because I don't see how we stand by with a Russian leader using nuclear weapons anywhere. I just don't think that's a tenable situation for the world.
You've remarked on the fact that Putin is using his nuclear weapons in Ukraine as a kind of shield to keep other nations out of the conflict, which is just an interesting and kind of terrifying dynamic. What does that tell us about the value of nuclear weapons then in this case, and how they might be used in the future?
It is really, I won't say fascinating because it's so horrific, but we worried about this a lot in the case of North Korea. Having done a lot of work on the Korean Peninsula over the years, we were concerned that, protected by a nuclear insurance policy, that Kim Jong-un might be more aggressive, that he might take more action at the tactical level, what academics call the stability-instability paradox, that at the strategic level, nuclear weapons can be seen perhaps as preventing direct conflict between nuclear powers, but underneath that, at the tactical level, they actually allow things like Vietnam or Korea or other conflicts, and now we see in Ukraine. What we weren't, I don't think, prepared for is the idea that we ourselves would be the victims of nuclear blackmail and nuclear coercion, right? The United States and NATO have held out the prospect for our using nuclear weapons first to hold off a conventional attack by Russia on NATO territory. Some people think that's credible, some people think it's not. The idea that we ourselves would be the victim of that coercion, I think, is something we hadn't anticipated. And now I think it forces the United States and NATO to revisit exactly what our assumptions are about nuclear weapons, how stabilizing they are. Do we have all the capabilities we need to deter and respond at a conventional level to a conventional war? And if not, maybe we need to be redirecting some of our investments away from the nuclear sphere, because they clearly don't prevent Putin from making these nuclear threats, and dedicate them to things that actually do worry him, like conventional cooperation, expansion of NATO, and so forth.
Taking a step back, I mean, you and I both, I think, share this perspective that nuclear policy has not changed enough since the end of the Cold War. The United States and Russia still have excessive forces on high alert, ready for first use at any moment. Are there steps that you wish the two sides, or even one side, had taken before we got to this crisis that might have helped us now? And what steps can help us going forward to reduce nuclear risks?
It's always hard to look at hindsight and say, oh, well, we should have done this, we should have done that, right? I mean, there are people saying Ukraine should have never given up its nuclear weapons that were on its territory. I don't think that would have led to an independent Ukraine. So, it's really hard to get back into these alternative histories. I'm focused much more on what we need to be doing now. And it does not make sense to me that we should make the world safe for any country to threaten the first use of nuclear weapons. That does not support our interests. It doesn't make us or our allies more stable and more secure. And it's something that I believe firmly the United States and NATO don't need to do for its own security. And so, I think really getting aggressive about not only adopting no first use or sole purpose statements, where we say the sole purpose for nuclear weapons is to deter the use of nuclear weapons by others, but redirecting some of that money and time and effort into things that actually do protect allies, like conventional capabilities, cyber defenses, offensive cyber capabilities. And I think we also then have to get really serious, whether it's Putin or whatever comes after, in pursuing the types of approach that President Biden and Secretary of State Blinken proposed to Putin in the run-up to the war. It was remarkable to me that the package of diplomatic offers that the United States and NATO put together to try to avert this war included many of the things that had been talked about in the Obama administration about engaging Russia in a deep and sustained dialogue about strategic stability in Europe, including constraints on missile defense, intermediate range forces, conventional and nuclear, forward deployed nuclear weapons in Europe and in Western Russia, and in conventional capabilities. The broad suite of things that we know intermix to determine whether or not countries feel secure, insecure, whether they need to worry about preemption or whether they can take more defensive postures. And so I think we really need to be investing a lot more time and effort, not right now, because obviously the focus is on punishing Putin and forcing him to withdraw from Ukraine, but looking at some of the base assumptions about what is and is not in our interests in Europe and increasingly in Asia in terms of our military approaches. The balance between constraint and military and defense investments, I think, has been off for a long time. And we've decided that we could do whatever we want militarily because nobody can challenge us. And we now find ourselves in a situation where I think we probably would have invested a lot more time and effort in the diplomatic and restraint side of things if we could have. And I think we're going to have to get back there as soon as we can force this conflict to an end.
So the place to revisit U.S. nuclear policy and all of these related issues would be, of course, in the Nuclear Posture Review, which we understand has been drafted by the Pentagon. It is at the White House for review. It has been delayed because of Ukraine and other things. How would you hope that the White House in particular is rethinking the Nuclear Posture Review and the issues at play there, sole purpose, no first use, in light of Ukraine?
I mean, I'd like to think that they recognize that they can't come out with a nuclear posture review that leaves open the United States using nuclear weapons first and basically tacitly, if not explicitly, endorsing the approach that Putin has taken to nuclear threats. They will see it differently, but I just don't see how in this environment the United States should or would take that step. And so there are a couple of suggestions that I hope that they'll take on. At a minimum, they should revert back to the language that was pursued by President Obama, where he said that the United States seeks a world where we can adopt a sole purpose statement. That's something that I think President Biden personally believes would be in our interest. And if there are reasons that we can't, to be explicit about why we can't, what missions would be given over to nuclear weapons, and to dedicate the time and resources to replace those missions with other capabilities, to basically say, this is where we want to go, and this is how we're going to get there. And if they were serious about redirecting their time and effort to the threats that we actually face in terms of Putin's weaponizing risk, conventional and cyber and other threats to NATO capabilities, they would say that we ourselves don't need nuclear weapons for anything other than to deter or respond to a Russian or Chinese nuclear attack, that we are not going to initiate the use of nuclear weapons, but we will defend every inch of NATO territory and allied territory with everything else that we have. And that if a country were to use nuclear weapons against us or our allies, it would be suicide. To be very strong about it, because I don't think the United States needs to be anything but strong in this environment. But I think to enhance the credibility of our conventional strength, we should cast off what I think is seen as a less than fully credible statement that we ourselves are going to initiate a nuclear war with Russia or China.
Putin's actions in Ukraine have surprised and shocked many seasoned Russia experts. What was your response to the invasion, and how do you think this conflict ends?
I'm not surprised that Vladimir Putin ordered military action in Ukraine. I didn't think it would be this expansive. I didn't think that he was literally going to try to seize and occupy the entirety of the Ukrainian state, because any analyst that I've been following that I respect understands that he will never be able to succeed in holding on to that state without a massive investment of millions of troops to occupy, because the Ukrainian people simply will not sit down and allow it. So I am surprised at the breadth. I think what has really happened for everybody is, and it's shocking that it took an invasion of a European state, because of course we've seen Vladimir Putin's horrific behavior towards Chechnya, towards Syria, towards Russians in Russia. You know, there are elements of racial bias, and the victims now look like us, so we care a bit more, which I think should force us to reflect on why it takes that. But the fact that we are now at war in Europe is shocking. That a generation that has grown up knowing nothing but peace, if not stability, and our generation, Tom, that grew up looking at that as just insanity and hoping that we had left it behind forever, I think have recognized that it's hard to see a world in which Vladimir Putin can remain in power. That is somehow going to be acceptable or stable or sustainable. If he were to withdraw with his tail between his legs, even then, I think we would see the United States try to keep on a bulk of the economic pain that he has been forced to suffer, because I think we recognize that Putin and oligarchy and autocracy in Russia doesn't serve our interests and is not consistent with the path of stability. That's a much bigger geostrategic question, is what's the future of US and Western policy towards Russia after Ukraine. But right now, I think the only thing we see is a long drawn out struggle to punish Russia economically and in Ukraine militarily without us being directly involved, to the point where he has no choice but to recognize defeat. And then what happens to Putin after there, I think, is an open question.
And last question for you. How does someone like Putin withdraw or admit defeat or even leave Russia when, if he's pushed in a corner, right, he could react very badly? And of course, he still has 6,000 nuclear weapons.
Which is exactly why I think President Biden has rightly said, we are not sending US or NATO troops to fight in Ukraine, right? This is a battle we may not be able to win on the battlefield ourselves, that we can't win that for the Ukrainian people. We will defend NATO with everything we have. And I think it's demonstrated that Vladimir Putin understands that. He's attacked pretty much everybody else in Europe but NATO. But the only scenarios are bad ones, right? One is where Putin rewrites his own narrative in Russia and says, oh, what I was really after was just a deal on the Donbass, or a deal that Ukraine never joined NATO, or a deal that Ukraine not develop nuclear weapons, and somehow sells that at home. But given that he is economically punished and weakened, and that the people that have benefited from him have suffered, there's the question, I won't say it's the hope, but the question about whether he can sustain himself at home. He's been able to sustain himself because he's kept the people around him rich and fat and happy. If that's no longer the case, then he's not as valuable to them. The other question is whether there's any scenario that Putin can accept defeat, whether he believes his own narrative, that he is, in fact, the man to bring glory back to Russia. And in that case, failure is not an option. And I think that's why, as horrible as it is, we may have to accept a long, bloody battle in Ukraine the same way we accepted or forced Russia to accept a long, bloody battle in Afghanistan, and then they forced us to accept very much the same, that may actually take place in Ukraine. And we may have to build walls to control escalation so that Ukraine doesn't metastasize. I don't know exactly how to do that in perpetuity. I don't see that as a clean scenario, because I think Putin will increasingly look at places like Belarus. He will increasingly look to punish NATO if he feels like he's losing. And all of those scenarios are really scary. So it's right for people to be worried. It's right for people to be concerned that this gets out of control. And it's why I think we support the Ukrainian leadership in negotiating with Putin. And if they can accept certain limits on the future of Ukraine's behavior that we ourselves are not imposing on them, I think we should be open to that. But that's different than saying we should let Putin win, because we know that letting Putin win in Syria and Chechnya, in Moldova, in Georgia, did not bring stability. It brought emboldenment.
Jon, thank you so much. Fascinating conversation. Would love to talk more, but we are out of time. Thanks again for your time, and best of luck with all your work.
Thanks, and be safe.
Thanks for listening to Press the Button. This podcast is produced and edited in Washington, D.C. by Lauren Billett and Angela Kelly, and in San Francisco by Jacqueline Shing and Delphine Vigil, with research and assistance from Alex Hall, Harry Tarpey, and Desiree Zemetis. Audio engineering and sound design by Jacqueline Shing. Our theme song is by Lyrics Born and the Poets of Rhythm, sampled with kind permission. Additional music by San Francisco-based bands 17 Evergreen and the Society of Rockets. To continue the dialogue and support our work, visit plowshares.org.